Assalamualaikum to Dr. Zuraida. My name is Nura Hayati binti Rosidi from KBA 2495B, and today I would like to present my group assignment, which is determinants of profitability of property in Malaysia. Firstly, I will present about the introduction. I will continue with a background of the study. Property sector is one of the economic sources which is vital in contributing the income of the country and also one of the country's asset. Malaysia's property sector is fractured and controlled by huge competitor because it is capital intensive. There were 865 companies listed on KLSE until December 2002, of which 82 or 9.4% were classified by the categorizations of the property industry. Because of beneficial demographic and the government's attempt to aid infrastructure development and home ownership, the residential property segment has been the mainstay of the property market in Malaysia over the last decades. Therefore, this study will be on determinants of profitability in property in Malaysia and will get more information and knowledge about the factors that contribute to the determinants of profitability in property. Besides, according to the research that has been carried out, the independent variables are macroeconomic indicator, which is interest rate, working capital management policy, liquidity ratio and debt to equity ratio. Otherwise, for dependent variable is profitability. Next, I will continue with a problem statement. Bank Negara Malaysia project indicate that due to impositions of global and domestic initiative to fight the COVID-19 pandemic, the economy will see a contraction of 2% at its worst and expansions of 1.5% at its highest in 2020. Due to pandemic, the country's economy has fallen and has affected the property sector in Malaysia. In addition, this year, the sector experienced a slight different activity due to what is happening around the world in relation to COVID-19. The main objective of this study is to determine the profitability of property and to identify things that have changed the property sector to grow rapidly in Malaysia. So, this study makes a research on how the factors would be affecting the property sectors in terms of profitability in Malaysia. Next are research questions. Research questions mean declarations of research purpose where the researchers like to respond. The research questions in this study is: does the working capital management policy affect the profitability on property? Does the interest rate affect the profitability on property? Does liquidity ratio affect the profitability on property? And does debt to equity ratio affect the profitability on property? Research objective. Research objective can be defined as declarations of research purpose where the researcher like to examine. The list of research objectives in this study is to analyze the relationship between working capital management policy and profitability, to examine the relationship between the interest rate and profitability, to determine the relationship between liquidity ratio and profitability, and lastly to analyze the relationship between debt to equity ratio and profitability. I will continue with a scope of the study. This study consists of return on asset, which is profitability as a dependent variable, and that is consists of 4 independent variables that affect the profitability of property in Malaysia. Among them are working capital management policies, liquidity ratio, interest rate and debt to equity ratio. In this study also, it had comprised of 10 properties company as the sample of the study, which are Eco World Development Group Berhad, Gamuda Land, IGB Berhad, Tropicana Corporation Berhad, IOI Property Group Berhad, Mahsin Group, Sain Darbi Properties Berhad, Guacoland Malaysia Berhad, Eastern and Oriental Berhad, and also UEM Sunrise. The method used in this study is regression analysis and descriptive statistical analysis. The regression analysis will produce a regression equation of this study. And the descriptive statistic will be described, examine and summarize the data set of the study. Next are limitations of the study. Small amount of Malaysian researcher investigating the profitability determinants of property in Malaysia. The result may be not be generalized for other countries as this study conducted only in Malaysia. This study only gets the sample data only in 2016 and the data sample are from Malaysia only. Significance of the study. This study may be benefit certain group of people such as the researcher, the financial sector and the government. The researcher might use this study for their beneficial to the future researchers, neither current researchers due to the tool use. And for the financial sector, this study will provide indicators of the financial sector's health. They can assist to recognize sources that could improve and damage the property industry efficiencies. And for the governments, the outcome of the study may have benefit the government. They can identify the negative or positive problem that can affect the property industry and try to overcome the problem by doing precaution steps on how to overcome the problem. Next, I will present on literature reviews. A review of literature. Firstly, profitability. The term of profitability is a significant element for any business to keep moving in property industry in Malaysia or other countries. According to Wahid, 2019, profitability can be measured by using selected ways such as financial reports every year, so it can help manage and control of management for business to run smoothly and also to avoid any risk that is coming. Secondly, working capital management policies and its relationship with profitability. Working capital management is essential in any sectors to manage the business operation effectively and efficiently. According to Horn and Westcovitz 2013, working capital management handles the management of company's current asset and funding to maintain current asset. Gracia Terrell and Martina Solano 2007 shows that working capital management policies has significant positive relationship with profitability of property. Thirdly, interest rate and its relationship with profitability. Interest rate is one of the macroeconomic indicator. According to Sohardi 2007, interest rate is an instrument that manages the monetary policy and investment climate because it binds the monetary sectors with real sector. The study by Rizki 2019 states that interest rate has significant impact on profitability in property. Besides, liquidity ratio and its relationship with profitability. Liquidity ratio is a type of financial ratio used by financial sectors to determine the capability of a company to pay off short-term debt. In addition, it can also determine whether the company's current asset can be enough to meet the company's business when the time comes. According to Chiber and Machundar, 1999 says that there are positive and significant results on quick ratio where the effect on return on sale can be associated with things given high cost and limited supply. Next are debt to equity ratio and its relationship with profitability. The debt on equity is defined as the proportion used to calculate the contrast between the fund given by the owner of the company and the fund from the lender of the company based on Rudin 2016. According to Rudin, he further said that the study conduct which has shown the result about the effect in financial leverage ratio of the debt to equity on profitability. This is a research framework as you can see in the pictures in the table where all the variables of the independent variable affect the dependent variable where working capital management policies, interest rate, liquidity ratio, debt to equity ratio has impact on profitability. Research hypotheses are H1 is working capital management policy has a relationship with profitability. H2, profitability has a relationship with interest rate. H3, liquidity ratio has a relationship with profitability. H4, profitability has a relationship with debt to equity ratio. Next, I will continue with our research methodology. I will continue with our research design, unit analysis, and type of data, which is cross-sectional data. Research design is this study will use data from the annual report of 10 properties company sector in Malaysia to measure ratios such as return on asset ratio, working capital management policies ratio, interest rate ratio, liquidity ratio, and debt to equity ratio. The data are used to analyze the relationship between the profitability of property sector in Malaysia and independent variables and provide the accurate evidence to prove the significant conclusions of this analysis. Unit analysis represent the degree of complexity of the data gathered. It is include their individuals, organizations, group, and even culture. The unit of analysis is the organization of property sector companies that comprise of 10 property sectors companies. Type of data that are used in the study is cross-sectional data. Cross-sectional data is the data that consists of two or more institutions over one period of time only. Usually, the data are comprising of organizations, companies, households, and more. Overall, this research use cross-sectional data where the institutions or entities are more than two. This study used 10 property sector companies in Malaysia as the variables. In addition, the data are taken only in 2016. Therefore, this data can be categorized as cross-sectional data if the study used one period of time only and used two or more variables. This is the measurements of variable. It consists of one dependent variable, which is profitability, and four independent variable, which is working capital management policies, interest rate, liquidity ratio, and debt to equity. And it shows how it's to measure and all the unit of the dependent variables and dependent variables are in percentage. Research model, which shows the mathematical model. Profitability can be measured by four independent variables, which are working capital management policies, interest rate, liquidity ratio, and debt to equity ratio. The mathematical model is profitability equal to alpha plus beta 1, which is working capital management policies, plus beta 2 interest rate, plus beta 3 liquidity ratio, and plus beta 4 debt to equity ratio. Data collections are comprised of 10 of the company that has been stated in our study, which is, for example, like IGB Group Berhad, IOIs, Properties Group Berhad, and more. Data analysis consists of descriptive statistics and regressions analysis. Descriptive statistics are brief descriptive coefficients that summarize a given data set, which can be either a representations of the entire or a sample of populations. For example, like mean, medians, max, and minimums, standard and standard deviations. Regressions analysis is it consists of one dependent variables and four independent variables. The profitability, which is ROA, which is return on asset of property sector, is represented as dependent variable that affected by working capital management policy, interest rate, liquidity ratio, and debt to equity ratio. This study analysed the data based on the panel regression method by using eView software. Next, I will continue on finding. This is the finding on descriptive statistic of the variables. The table 1 in our study shows that the average return, which is return on asset, is 0.03, range in from 0.0098 to 0.067. Among all the independent variables, the working capital management policy has the highest means ratio of 2.6675, which ranging from 1.399 to 5.0500. This is followed by liquidity ratio with with the mean ratio of 1.126 varies from 0.5 to 1.56. The next one is followed by debt to equity ratio, which with the mean ratio of 0.6388 ranging from 0.263 to 1.0409. On the other hand, interest rate has the lowest mean ratio of negative 6.06 ranging from negative 40.4 to 2.7. By comparing the value of the standard deviations of all control variables, the interest rate ratio has the highest, which is 13.13, followed by the working capital management policy with the value of 1.082, and still followed by liquidity ratio with the value of 0.397, and the debt to equity ratio coming as the lowest with the value of 0.263. This is the regressions analysis where it shows the relationship between profitability and all the independent variables. Firstly, is working capital management policies has positive relationship with profitability with coefficient 0.000431. That is statistically insignificant relationship between working capital management policy and profitability because the profitability is 0.9694 bigger than 0.05. Then the first hypothesis is rejected. Next is interest rate. The relationship between interest rate and profitability also has positive relationship with the value of 2.17. It shows that there are statistically insignificant relationship between interest rate and profitability because profitability is 0.9842 is bigger than p-value, which is 0.05. Then the second hypothesis is also rejected. Next is liquidity ratio, and profitability also related with each other due to its positive relationship. It shows that there is statistically insignificant relationship between liquidity ratio and profitability because the profitability for liquidity ratio is 0.9808, which is bigger than p-value, which is 0.05. This hypothesis also rejected. Lastly, debt to equity ratio. Its relationship with profitability are negative relationship with the value of coefficients negative 0.017129. It shows that there is statistically insignificant relationship between debt to equity ratio and profitability because the probability for debt to equity ratio is 0.458. 0.4568 is bigger than p-value, which is 0.05. So hypothesis is rejected. The model demonstrates that coefficients of multiple determinations, which is R squared, is 0.058532. Thus, 5.85% of the variation in the dependent variable explained by the independent variable of the model. The remaining of 94.15% could be explained by the independent variable that are not mentioned in this study. F-test provide that F is equal to 0.77714 at a significant level of 0.985879. Thus, in sum, all of the four hypotheses reveal that all the independent variables have insignificant relationship with the profitability of property companies in Malaysia. Next, I will explain more on discussion. First discussion will be on to analyze the relationship between working capital management policies and profitability. In parallel to this, hypothesis 1 was tested to meet the research objective. The present finding indicate that there is insignificant relationship between working capital management policies and profitability. This present finding is contradict with research finding that are conducted by Freeman Shah 2018, where it shows that working capital management policies has positive effect on profitability. Besides, the present finding is also contradict with Garcia Teruel and Martinez Solano 2007, where they claim that working capital management policies has significant positive relationship with profitability of property. Furthermore, the previous finding it is contravened with a study by Horn and Watzkowitz said that working capital management policies out to increase profitability, and there are studies that stated insistent working capital management policies would increase the profitability. Second discussion will be on to examine the relationship between the interest rate and profitability. The second objective is to analyze the relationship between the interest rate and profitability. In parallel to this, hypothesis 2 was tested to meet the research objective. The present finding indicates that there is insignificant relationship between interest rate and profitability. In fact, this result is contravening to a study conducted by Risky 2019, where he stated that interest rate has significant effect on profitability of property. In addition, this present finding contradict with research by Sri Mona Octavia 2010 state that there is significant negative relationship between interest rate and property companies. Third discussion will be on to determine the relationship between liquidity ratio and profitability. The objective of the study is to analyze the relationship between the liquidity ratio and profitability. The analysis of the study data shows that the current ratio does not significantly affect the profitability on property. This present finding is supported because of Ruding said that the liquidity ratio plays a simultaneous role in profitability of property. Besides, there are people argue that there are other external factors that exist determine the profitability on property. Next, profitability also having the negative impact due to the current asset. This finding is proven by Risky 2019, which he said that current assets have a negative impact on profitability. In the end, the relationship between liquidity ratio and profitability are not significant, which means it is contradict with the study. Last discussion will be on to analyze the relationship between debt to equity ratio and profitability. The third objective of the study is to identify the relationship between debt to equity ratio and profitability. In parallel to this, hypothesis 4 was tested to meet the research objective. The present finding indicate that there is no significant relationship between debt to equity ratio and profitability. This present finding is contradicted with research by Taki 2019 state that the debt ratio has a negative effect on return on asset, which is profitability. The long-term debt ratio shows a negative and serious effect on return on asset, which is profitability also. Therefore, the results are different from the finding. Then it is concluded that the effect of debt to equity ratio on profitability of property is insignificant to the properties companies. The recommendations for this study is companies might obtain a better degree of profitability through handling inventory successfully by effective account receivable management, which means accelerating the accumulation of cash from the processing of receivable account, regulating inventory volume through increasing product inventory days transactions, in order to maximize the availability of the company so that they can receive the desired return. Companies owners can consider appropriate working capital funding method. Investor in property and real estate firms should also evaluate the leverage liquidity ratio and profitability ratio as consideration of making investment decisions. Last but not least, companies need to use a sufficient portion of debt and equity to finance services that have low capital costs and more portion of debt utilizations by short-term debt, while less portion of long-term debt. Last but not least, the conclusion that can be concluded is The present study aims to assess the determinants of profitability of property in Malaysia. In assessing the determinants of profitability of property in Malaysia include working capital management policies, interest rate, liquidity ratio and debt to equity ratio to measure the determinants of the property. From the finding, all the hypotheses were insignificant and it shows that the independent variable not influence the determinants of profitability on property. On a final note, the present study reconfirmed that the independent variable of this study, which is working capital management policies, interest rate, liquidity ratio and debt to equity ratio, does not affect the profitability of property in Malaysia. Working capital management policy, interest rate and liquidity ratio indicate positive and show insignificant impact on the determinants of profitability of property in Malaysia, while debt to equity indicate that negative and also shows insignificant relationship with the profitability of property in Malaysia. Interestingly, it shows that all the independent variable of this study does not impact the profitability of property in Malaysia.